actually their courage.
So many things I want to talk about right now. I've read a number of reports that have talked about how over the last 2 years of COVID or COVIDian, some people call it, policy, has resulted in kind of a mass bailout, again, for this kind of, fusion managerial government class.
Absolutely right. Yeah. It's a great point. I actually had not thought about the 2008 analogy until you just mentioned it. I think it's spot on.
Is this economy that you're describing, okay, is this economy, this new economy, is it something that can counter this sort of activity, which seems to happen, in times of the biggest crisis?
Yeah.
This group that you're describing is the one that kind of gets away with, what's effectively a massive redistribution of wealth, right?
Absolutely.
It's unbelievable.
I think that is absolutely possible.
Yeah.
That is absolutely right. If the right business leaders step up to capture the opportunity. The consumers in this country and in Canada and in Europe and in Australia are waiting, are saying, we are here to reward you with our buying power. Can you step up with high quality, and quality is important here, but high quality alternatives that ultimately come to me with a message that I deserve to be respected with? And if the right class of business leaders and entrepreneurs step up, I think it is the defining economic opportunity of our generation. And we will look back, companies like Facebook were born not on a technology, they were born on fundamental human insights about human psychological frailties, okay? Where they said that we can prey on someone's envy or their lust or their insecurities, their psychic insecurities, to open up a lens into their deepest wants and desires that proved to be the treasure trove of the last 2 decades to build a digital advertising economy that ended up creating the greatest economic force in modern human history. It was a turning point. I don't think it was a turning point for the better, but I think it was a turning point nonetheless. I think we're at one of those turning points where there's a good way this plays out and a bad way this plays out. I'll tell you both ways it plays out. There is a hunger for a cause, for meaning, for purpose, for identity that are not being served up through our politics or through other institutions that could be accessed through, the left has done a good job of this in creating a blue economy that tells young people that they can go to Ben & Jerry's and order a cup of ice cream with a cup of morality on the side and say that it's left-wing morality that gives you a fast food answer to that moral hunger. There's an opportunity across the rest of the country too. Here's what I don't want to see happen. It could happen, and I think it's a business opportunity and people can capture it. Here's what I don't want to see though, personally as a citizen, is a right-wing alternative. To say that we're going to create the right-wing alternatives to that and sell a lot of goods by ultimately offering the red economy in response. Why don't I want to see that? A, I think it's cheap for sort of satisfying that moral hunger. It doesn't really do the job. It's just the equivalent of French fries and fast food. But I also don't want to see it because once we get to a red and blue version of everything, of coffee, as we have today, of pillows, as we have today, if we get to baseball and football and basketball, I think that's the beginning of the end of the American experiment as we know it, or at least it could be. I don't want to see that. However, I think the better business strategy, and even more importantly, the better strategy for our culture and our country, is business leaders who step up and offer a universalist vision to say that actually, we don't want to mix up politics with business, that we want to just pursue excellence unapologetically, that is our agenda. People are hungry for that message, and I think that message will be more successful because actually I think a lot of people on the center left and in other parts of the populist left will come along too. But I think that more importantly, it will have the effect of swinging the pendulum back, because once you then steal 1 million customers at a time from the Nikes and Airbnbs and BlackRocks and JP Morgan Chases and American Expresses of the world, that's what's going to cause them to then wake up and say, you know what? Our approach to diversity and inclusion over the last 10 years might not have been as diverse and inclusive as we thought it was. And guess what? They're going to have to come back and win back those customers with a more depoliticized approach. That's, to me, what the end state looks like. That's what the promised land in the next step looks like for us. I think we're probably more likely to get there through our culture and through our economy than we are through our politics. I have some views on how we can get there through our politics too. But I think that this is actually a more promising path that I'm more optimistic on.
That's super interesting. So you mentioned, the ESG agenda and the Great Reset agenda, which are of course connected. I think it's ESG is originally Klaus Schwab's,
stakeholder
sort of vision.
Capitalism, yes. ESG, corporate social responsibility. Call it what you want. It is the apologist model of capitalism that merges state power with corporate power to create the modern form of fascism. That's what I think it is.
Well, okay. Lay it out for me.
So I think fascism is by definition the merger of governmental power with corporate power. And I think what some of them may have begun in well-intentioned ways. I've never met Klaus Schwab. I have every reason to think that actually he's probably a good-hearted man. I read his book. I reviewed it for the Wall Street Journal last year. There was a certain naivete to it that actually led me to think that he wasn't some sort of conspiratorial puppet master behind the scenes. I think there are business leaders who are running with his philosophies who are. But he's a gentle elder man who kind of had a worldview that I think was wrong and off the mark and not terribly well argued. But I have no reason to think that he's a cynical, world conqueror. He's a man who offered an innocent philosophy that happened to be misguided, that was co-opted by other cynical forces that are using it to achieve their own ends. Now, what this new movement is about using private power to accomplish through the private sector what government could not do through the front door. And in return, private companies using government to gain competitive advantages that they couldn't have actually gained in a true free market. So I'll tell you what I mean. There's a Green New Deal that never got passed in Congress. Well, guess what? Who needs the Green New Deal when you have the ESG agenda, where John Kerry goes around to one bank after another and gets them to sign the so-called climate pledge that says that they won't lend to projects that the party in power disfavors. Well, guess what? That's using governmental power to do through the back door what government couldn't do through the front door. And I will tell you, Jan, I think you know this, banks are not charitable institutions. So when they sign that climate pledge, what are they getting in return? That is the question we need to be asking. Big tech censorship. You have a party in power in the House, in the Senate, in the White House, that is coordinating with technology companies to censor content that government could not censor directly under the First Amendment. I say that if it's state action in disguise, then the Constitution still applies. But what do these firms then get in return is they get favors through the black door. I called it black door because of BlackRock. It was probably a slip of the tongue, but BlackRock has half their alumni up and down staffing the Biden administration. They get to be the administrator of the COVID-19 relief stimulus packages. And guess what? They've managed to grow themselves now to becoming the world's largest asset manager in the process while preaching the ESG gospel at every step of the way. So that is the new form of crony capitalism. But people in new firms need to call it out and tap into, I think, an energy that is demanding change. It is time, as I say, to reset the Great Reset. And I think we are hungry for doing it. And that's what I'm looking to play a role in doing as well.
Well, okay, but I wanted... There's a lot of buzz about the Great Reset. Frankly, there's a lot of discussion about ESG as well, so I want to touch on that. But what's the Great Reset?
The Great Reset is the use of COVID-19 and other catastrophes to be able to achieve something that people would have otherwise never accepted, which was a merger of power across the different institutional spheres of our lives. You had universities over here, you had an economy over here, you had a government over here. The Great Reset is all about dissolving the boundaries between those institutions to give the managerial elites in charge of each of them power over not just one of them at a time, but over all of them at the same time. That is what the Great Reset is all about. And the question is what everyday citizens are going to be able to do about it before it's too late. I personally think there's a lowercase r Great Reset going on in the other direction, to say that actually they're the truckers you see in Canada, who smell what's happening, and they know that they see not just a political movement, but a pan-institutional movement that is set up to permanently exclude them in the name of inclusion, and they're not going to stand for it. And these two Great Resets, I think, are coming to a head. Not quite in the 2022 election cycle, because that's about, Joe Biden's, poor policies and the Let's Go Brandon agenda in response. I frankly am kind of bored by that. I don't find the 2022 election to be terribly interesting. I know that's what a lot of the Republican politicians are either say or are supposed to say they're excited about, to take back the House and Senate. I find that kind of boring because at the end of the day, I think it's probably going to happen. The question is, what does that conservative movement actually stand for? We need real answers to that question. But I think that once that moment has passed, I think the 2 years that come after that are going to be all about these two forces coming to a head. The great institutional reset, taking education and the economy and the governments in power in democracies around the world and dissolving the boundaries between them. And the lowercase r reset in response to say that, no, we the people in democracies defected from old world Europe. We came to the new world because we rejected the idea that a small group of managerial elites decide behind closed doors what's good for the rest of us in society at large. Those two forces are coming together, and they're coming to a head, and there is going to be a great realignment between November 2022 and probably November 2024 or January 2025 in the private sector and in the path to the next U.S. presidential election that determines which vision wins. Is it the vision of European monarchy, or is it the new world vision of capital D, democracy in a democratic republic? That is the question. I come out on one side of that. Klaus Schwab's capital G, capital R, Great Reset comes out on the other side of that. The next 2 years after we're done with the 2022 election distraction is going to actually answer that question.
Okay, and that's fascinating. So what is this realignment that you're envisioning?
So I could break in one of two directions. The realignment I would like to see is a dissolution of the managerial layer that intermediates what an institution stands for and the people who that institution is actually supposed to serve. Let's talk about the government. Here's my biggest criticism of President Trump. He had some of the right intentions to drain the swamp. He didn't actually do it because at the end of the day, he resorted to incremental reform, okay? And I'm sympathetic to him because these are hard decisions to make. But at the end of the day, we don't need Republican leaders or conservative leaders to incrementally reform a government agency by saying that we're going to put a different person in charge and we're going to cut its budget and starve it. That's old school conservative solutions that resort to, you know, I would say superficial ideas about saving money and then we can lower taxes. Look, I'm all for those things too. But the question for the conservative movement to ask right now is why is it we want to do those things? Is it because we want to save money and grow the size of the economic pie, which great stuff, I love it. Is that the main reason why though? Or is it because we actually care about the integrity of a democracy where the will of the people are ultimately represented and the people who we elect to put in charge are actually the people who are in charge rather than a bureaucratic layer that is insulated from political accountability? And if that's the reason why you stand for reducing the size of government, then there's one solution. When you get in charge of the alphabet soup, from the NIH to the FBI to the FTC to the SEC, the answer isn't to incrementally reform those bureaucracies. It is to shut them down and to replace them with something new because there's a managerial cancer that's insulated from political accountability that those very people, you can't treat one metastasis at a time. You can't treat the symptom by treating a cancer with a Tylenol and a Band-Aid. If you want to treat a cancer, you need to ultimately get rid of the tumor itself. And I think we're going to need Republican or I don't care if they're Republican, conservative, or I don't even care if they're conservative, American leaders with the gall to be able to actually dissolve the institutions that are the source of the managerial cancer and problem in the first place. And by the way, we're going to need the same thing in the private sector, but there I'm more optimistic of being able to get there through market competitive forces if we have entrepreneurs and business leaders who are brave enough to capture the opportunity of serving the truckers, for lack of a better description, because, you know, speaking of the news the last couple of weeks, who have different demands. That's the realignment. Is it going to be the trucker realignment, who ultimately says that we the people ultimately need to have our voices heard and represented, or is it going to be the Great Reset realignment that says that we need to dissolve the boundaries between the managerial elites in charge of our universities and our companies and our governments to be able to work together to dissolve those boundaries to reset in a different direction horizontally? Is it a vertical Great Reset, or is it a horizontal Great Reset? That is the question of our time.
Are you suggesting that you're expecting kind of democracy to disappear with version 1?
With the capital G Great Reset, I think that's the disappearance of democracy as we know it. It is the institution of modern monarchy where we don't have one king, we have kings that together work. We have a bureaucratic layer that collectively represents a technocratic king. That's what that looks like. That is Klaus Schwab's vision. That is the Great Reset. It is what Larry Fink implements through BlackRock, the world's largest asset manager, which aggregates capital from everyday Americans and votes those shares in corporate America in ways that would make the ultimate owners of that capital actually would make their blood boil if they actually knew what was going on. That's what that one model looks like. The other model is to say that we return the power back to the people who ultimately created those institutions in the first place, in the private sector, to tell BlackRock and other institutions like it, and State Street too for that matter, that it's not your money, it is our money. And we will vote our shares in the ways that we believe those shares ought to be voted, not in the way that you, King Fink, decide they should be voted. And by the way, to tell the people in government the same thing, to say that it might be Joe Biden, it might be Donald Trump, it might be somebody else in the future, but we want the people who run the government to be the people who we actually elect to run the government, not the managerial elites who ultimately pull the strings from behind the scenes. And as I said, that was my major criticism of President Trump, is not that he didn't have the right vision, but he didn't do enough to actually Fire Anthony Fauci. He could have done it. Shut down the FBI that did not want to vet his own nominees for the government. He didn't do it. And I think that at the end of the day, we're going to require leaders. It's hard because you get advice to say all the adverse consequences and here's a million reasons why you can't do it. You're going to have leaders who ultimately to say that, yeah, I hear that, but I'm going to do it anyway. And to the extent we have needs that need to be fulfilled, I'm going to create something new to fill its place. That's the only way we're going to actually accomplish this.
What you're describing feels like such a tall order.
It is. It is. I mean, I think that our times call for great leaders who are willing to do extraordinary things. And if those great leaders don't rise to the occasion, then I think it's the beginning of the end of the American vision. However, I think that it is moments like these that select for great leaders to emerge. Ronald Reagan was a product of the late 1970s. Ronald Reagan would have never risen to power at the end of the 80s because we didn't need Ronald Reagan then. We needed Ronald Reagan at the end of the 70s. Now, we need the Ronald Reagan of our moment, not just in the public sector, but in the private sector and education too, to rise to the occasion at a moment where we need those leaders today. Not to, memorize, not to recite slogans we memorized from Ronald Reagan in 1980. We need to meet the unique solutions of our time. That's what Reagan did in 1980. That's what we need new leaders to do in 2022. And I'm hopeful, Jan, that we're going to see it. If we don't, I think the consequences are going to be very bad, but I am hopeful we're going to see it in the next 3 years.
Well, and it's interesting because what you're describing also, the whole, let's say, fallout of these of COVID policy is a kind of when you mentioned a realignment earlier, there are all sorts of people that, it's not, there's a bit of political sort of alignment there, but there's a whole lot of people that found themselves suddenly thinking, I don't know if I like this policy, and they were not right wing at all, right?
Right.
For example. So I think there's a kind of a, do you see that? Like, I think there is this kind of a realignment, or some people have called it the great filter or something.
I was on Bill Maher's show a couple weeks ago. Bill Maher and I disagree probably on a lot of issues and conventional policy, but we both agree that the way we should work out those questions is through free speech and open debate in the public sphere. And I think that we're at this moment where, Tulsi Gabbard, Democratic candidate for president of the United States in the last election, was a featured speaker here at CPAC. I'll be seeing her, later this afternoon, sitting down myself with her. At the end of the day, we're in a moment where labels matter less than actually the movements that call for either the everyday people being heard or the institutional elites ultimately wielding power. That's the real defining struggle of our time. And whether it's the woke movement or the left versus right question, those are distractions to the real question of our time, which actually goes to the inherent true power of a democracy.
Well, Vivek Ramaswamy, it's such a pleasure to have you on again.
Thank you, Jan. Good to see you.
We live in an age of censorship and disinformation, where some of the most prominent voices, most important voices, aren't actually being heard because they're being suppressed. I invite some of these people onto the show, onto American Thought Leaders. So to stay up to date on the most recent episodes and our exclusive content, you can actually sign up for our newsletter at theepochtimes.com/newsletter. Just hit the checkbox for American Thought Leaders.